You were never supposed to hear this name. Jeremiah Holbrook. A boy, 12 years old. Forgotten by history because what he uncovered in the California Gold Hills was too disturbing to survive the official record. They buried it beneath graves, beneath ledgers, beneath silence. But Jeremiah did something dangerous. He counted the bodies, and something didn't add up. He wasn't a lawman. He wasn't a killer. He was something worse in the eyes of those who profit from darkness. He was aware. Now listen carefully. In 1861, during the height of America's westward madness, a child with a dead father and a mother too poor to say no found himself working in a place that only ever smells of two things: formaldehyde and secrets. The funeral parlor of Silas Fletcher in Sutter's Creek was a quiet little room, a coffin factory by day, a temple of silence by night. The bodies arrived fast and often. Mine collapses, dysentery, knifings in back alleys over gold claims not worth the dust they were dug from. That's what they told the town. But Jeremiah, he didn't believe in what they told the town, because he saw the real tally. They said 27 people had died that spring. Jeremiah counted 43. 16 bodies too many. 16 names not written in any book. 16 men who had gold, land, or power, and then, suddenly, had none of the three. And what do you do when you're 12 and no one listens? You write it all down, every detail, every bruise, every missing watch, pouch, or tooth with gold in it. He called it the Ledger of the Vanished, a boy's notebook. But inside it, the most dangerous document west of the Mississippi, because it didn't just track death. It exposed a pattern. Someone in Sutter's Creek was orchestrating murder. Someone with a badge. Someone whose name lived above the law. And Jeremiah? He had no idea that by opening that first casket he had already begun counting his own days. You see, a town like Sutter's Creek wasn't built on gold. It was built on greed wearing a friendly face. And when gold fever grips a town, it doesn't just rot the morals of thieves. It poisons the law. It sickens the righteous. It turns sheriffs into syndicates and deputies into death dealers. Jeremiah Holbrook at 12 had a mind that worked like clockwork. Every coffin, every toe tag, every natural death was a puzzle he quietly solved. Not because he wanted to, but because the dead spoke to him. Not in words, but in patterns. A broken wrist that didn't match a fall. Missing possessions that no one questioned. A man found dead with no blood left in his clothes, yet stabbed was the listed cause. He saw it all. But the town just kept on drinking. Miners buried their friends one day and gambled their claims the next. No one looked back. Because in gold country, looking back meant remembering you had a soul. But Jeremiah couldn't stop. He had learned something that men twice his age never understand. The dead keep count, and they wanted someone to notice. So he started mapping them. Every body that came through the parlor. He drew lines between names, connections, patterns, repetitions, and something vile began to take shape. 3 of the disappeared had claims in the same ravine. 2 more had struck large veins and reported it the day before they died. None had family in California. All were buried fast, sometimes within hours of death, without inquiry, and each one had their claim reassigned. You think that's a coincidence? No. This was a harvesting operation, a silent system of extermination dressed up in paperwork and hidden beneath a sermon. And when Jeremiah tried to speak up, when he asked Mr. Fletcher why no one was investigating, the undertaker stared him down with eyes that no longer belonged to a man. "Boy," he said, "some truths ain't good for your health." That night, Jeremiah found something nailed to the back door of the parlor. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't even words. Just a single severed finger, still wearing a gold ring. The message was clear. Keep counting, and you won't be around to finish. Men die every day. But in Sutter's Creek, they disappeared. And the difference matters. A death is mourned. A disappearance is absorbed, repackaged, profited from. Jeremiah Holbrook didn't have the language for institutional corruption. He didn't know the word conspiracy, but he knew theft when he saw it. And this wasn't just gold being stolen. This was identity, land, legacy. And in a lawless frontier pretending to have laws, that made it worse than murder. It made it ritual. By his 4th week working the funeral parlor, Jeremiah had begun to catalogue what he called the strange bodies. Not the ones brought in with family, not the ones buried with tears, but the quiet ones, the unclaimed ones, the ones brought in after midnight by silent men wearing clean boots and grim faces. They didn't weep, they didn't explain, they just dropped off a corpse and left with pockets full of silence. That's how Chen Wei arrived. A soft-spoken Chinese prospector known for his odd maps and meticulous work. The boy remembered him. Chen had once given Jeremiah a folded paper crane and said, "To remember who you are." He was dead 3 days later. Cause of death? Dysentery. But the body told a different story. Under the layers of burial garments, Jeremiah found bruising around the neck, a small puncture wound behind the left ear, and worst of all, nothing in his pockets. Not the jade necklace he wore daily, not the pouch of nuggets he had shown off just a week prior. Gone. All of it erased, like he never existed. But Jeremiah remembered him, and that made him dangerous. That night, the boy broke the first rule of survival in Sutter's Creek. He returned to the site of the dead. Chen's claim was untouched. His tools still lay beside the creek, but his tent had been slashed. His journal, hidden beneath a floorboard, remained, written in Chinese. Maps, names, symbols, and sketches of mining claims that overlapped with the other vanished men. Jeremiah couldn't read it, but he understood it. Chen had been watching them too. He wasn't just a miner, he was a messenger. And someone didn't like the message. As Jeremiah tucked the journal beneath his shirt and vanished into the darkness, he didn't know it yet, but he had just stolen from the most powerful man in town, and there would be no more warnings, only consequences. Power doesn't announce itself with thunder. It whispers. It slides into town wearing a badge, shaking hands, baptizing babies, and signing death warrants behind closed doors. Sheriff Benjamin Coleman was that kind of power. To the people of Sutter's Creek, he was the law. To the men dropping bodies off at the funeral parlor, he was the system. And to Jeremiah Holbrook, he was the man whose shadow stretched over every grave the boy had recorded. Because on the night Jeremiah stole Chen Wei's journal, he wasn't the only one watching. He had climbed the canyon walls like a fox. He'd hidden in the dark like a ghost. But ghosts don't leave footprints, and men like Coleman don't miss them. By morning, the sheriff's boots were back in the dirt. 5 men on horseback, lanterns, rifles, and a single phrase that nearly stopped Jeremiah's heart. Make sure he didn't leave anything behind. They were sanitizing the scene. You don't sanitize unless you have something to hide. As Jeremiah watched from a thicket high above the ravine, he saw it, a blueprint of corruption. Sheriff Coleman stood where Chen's tent had once been, glancing at a list one of his men handed him. He smiled. Good. These maps'll save us weeks. This Chinaman was more useful than he knew. Then, turning to a man whose voice Jeremiah recognized instantly, Deputy Patterson, the sheriff said something that should have chilled the marrow of any honest soul. Lee arrives tomorrow. Keep him poor, keep him scared, and he'll do what Chen did, for half the price. They weren't just robbing miners. They were recruiting replacements, spies embedded in the camps, sent to mark the next victim. When they outlived their usefulness, a bullet, a staged death, a missing claim, a new grave. This wasn't law enforcement. It was a machine, a death economy, built to churn gold from blood. And now Jeremiah was inside, at the gears. By the time the sheriff's men rode off, Jeremiah had already memorized half the map in Chen's journal. He was no longer counting bodies. He was counting names, next names. And if he was right, the next man to die would be Klaus Fuber, a German immigrant working a secluded claim northeast of town. He had 2 things Jeremiah now understood were fatal in Sutter's Creek. He was rich and alone. You have to understand something. Jeremiah Holbrook was no hero. He was a child drowning in a system designed to erase witnesses. But what made him dangerous wasn't courage, it was obsession. He didn't run, he didn't beg. He did what the system feared most. He paid attention. That night, by the light of a stolen lantern and with shaking hands, Jeremiah opened his ledger and began a new page. Not for the dead, but for the next to die. At the top, he wrote one name, Klaus Wuber. Jeremiah didn't know much about the man, only that he worked alone, only that his quartz vein was so rich the dust shimmered in the river like frost, and only that Sheriff Coleman had already filled out the paperwork to seize the claim before Klaus was dead. They had a schedule. A machine needs oil, it also needs silence. Jeremiah broke both. He left the funeral parlor under cover of fog, making his way through the Black Forest toward Deer Creek. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't carry food. Only two things: Chenway's journal and the broken pocket watch of Magnus Carlsen, a relic of the first man Jeremiah knew had been murdered. It was almost poetic. A boy bearing relics of the dead, racing to prevent the next. When he reached Klaus's camp, the air was still. A small fire crackled, and there he was, Klaus, tall, weathered, and startled as hell when a filthy 12-year-old emerged from the trees holding a blood-stained ledger. Jeremiah didn't waste time. He spoke like a child possessed. He told the truth, all of it. The false deaths, the claim thefts, the puncture wounds, the shadow men, the coming kill. At first, Klaus didn't believe him. Who would? But then Jeremiah handed him Chen's map, and the German's face turned to stone. "My name is here," he whispered. "So is my yield, my boundaries." Jeremiah nodded. "You're already dead. You just haven't stopped breathing yet." The wind picked up. In the distance, they heard the faint rhythm of hooves on dirt. "They're early," Klaus muttered, already grabbing a rifle. Jeremiah's heart slammed in his chest, because suddenly this wasn't theory anymore. This was the moment when paranoia either became madness or proof, and now they had less than 10 minutes to decide: hide, run, or fight the system that harvests men for gold. They say when a man is about to die, he hears everything louder. His heartbeat, his breath, his regret. Klaus Wuber heard none of that. What he heard was the click of a rifle bolt, and the calm voice of a boy who had stopped being a boy 3 graves ago. "They'll come from the West Ridge. Sheriff's men always ride with the sun behind them. It blinds the camps." Jeremiah wasn't guessing. He knew. He'd watched them collect bodies like lumber. He'd seen their patterns. He'd memorized their steps. They had 10 minutes, maybe less. Klaus buried the map under a slab of rock. Jeremiah doused the fire with a bucket of creek water. Then, using the last trick he learned from the undertaker, he smeared blood from a rabbit across a burlap shirt and laid it across Klaus's cot. It looked like murder. They made it look easy. Then they vanished into the trees. Minutes later, just as predicted, the riders came, 3 of them. Deputy Patterson, a man in black Jeremiah didn't recognize, and worst of all, Doc Whitmer, the coroner, the man who signed every fraudulent death certificate in Sutter's Creek. That's how they did it. The law and the doctor, the bullet and the pen. Together, they turned murder into paperwork. From the shadows, Jeremiah and Klaus watched them dismount. No urgency, no grief. They walked into the camp like landlords returning to a property. Then the plan collapsed. The man in black knelt near the bloodied cot, touched it and said, "It's Rabbit. They know." Panic surged in Jeremiah's throat, but Klaus put a hand on his shoulder. Not fear. Focus. What happened next, Jeremiah never forgot. Klaus stepped from the brush with his rifle raised and fired. One shot, straight through the man in black's skull. A silence fell across the canyon. Not fear. Recalculation. Patterson dove for cover. Whitmer screamed and fled into the woods, and Jeremiah, he ran. Not because he was a coward, but because someone had to remember. The gunfire echoed behind him like a curse. He didn't know if Klaus lived. He didn't look back. He just ran. And by the time he reached the funeral home, soaked in sweat and shaking, he knew only one thing for certain. This wasn't about gold anymore. It was about the ledger, the list of names, the map of death, the proof that power had been murdering men under a false flag of law. And Jeremiah Holbrook was now carrying the evidence they'd kill entire towns to bury. Sutter's Creek had no church bells, but it knew when to be silent. The morning after the shootout at Klaus Fuber's camp, a strange hush fell over the town. The saloon didn't open. The schoolhouse doors stayed shut. Even the dogs didn't bark. They were waiting. And when Sheriff Coleman rode in with blood on his coat and rage in his eyes, they got their answer. The system had been wounded. One of their men was dead, another missing, and the boy with the ledger gone. The funeral parlor became a fortress. Inside, Jeremiah hid beneath the floorboards, tucked between crates of embalming fluid and dusty hymnals left behind from a time when death had the dignity of prayer. Mr. Albert, the mortician, didn't ask questions. He just fed the boy scraps and left him with a whisper. "Stay quiet, and if they ask, you've been gone since Tuesday." Outside, the sheriff held court like a king. He stood on the courthouse steps and declared Klaus Fuber a deranged fugitive, blamed the shooting on foreign madness, promised swift justice. No one cheered, no one clapped, because everyone had heard the shots and no one had seen a body. You can't bury what isn't there. But Coleman didn't need proof, he needed control. So he did what cowards always do. He picked a new target. That night, 3 houses were raided. 2 immigrants disappeared. 1 teenage girl was dragged into jail on suspicion of sedition, whatever that meant. It was no longer about order. It was about obedience. And Jeremiah Holbrook watched it unfold from beneath the floor, his hands shaking, his mouth dry, his heart carving a hole in his chest. He had the ledger. He had the map. And more importantly, he had questions. Why did the sheriff mark certain graves with stones while others were left bare? Why were some bodies buried outside the cemetery fence? Why were names like Patterson, Whitmer, and even Coleman himself scratched in the margins of Chen Wei's journal under a column labeled "Buy-in Dividends"? This wasn't just murder. This was an investment scheme. They weren't covering up death. They were profiting from it. And somewhere in those pages, Jeremiah realized there were still 4 names left uncrossed. The machine wasn't finished. And he was next. You might think a child can't go mad. You'd be wrong. By his 12th night in hiding, Jeremiah Holbrook wasn't sleeping. He wasn't crying. He wasn't thinking like a child anymore. He was counting. Every creak of the floor above, every footstep outside the parlor. Every time Mr. Albert tapped the hidden floorboard twice to signal, "They're gone now." Paranoia wasn't fear. It was pattern recognition. And by now Jeremiah could see the pattern clearly. 1. A man finds gold. 2. He files a claim. 3. He's approached by someone offering protection. 4. He refuses. 5. He disappears. 6. His land is seized by the county. 7. The next man steps forward, knowing he'll be next. That's how they kept order, through terror dressed in legality. And the worst part, it wasn't just the sheriff, it wasn't just the doctor. There were buyers. Jeremiah found the receipts tucked in the lining of Chen Wei's journal. Names, dates, sums paid in silver. It wasn't a conspiracy, it was a business model. And then came the letter, slipped under the funeral home door. No stamp, no signature, just one sentence written in trembling ink. "You saw too much. The claim is sealed. Come outside." Jeremiah didn't move. Instead, he brought out the map, the receipts, and the ledger. He laid them side by side and began connecting the marks with thread pulled from an old burial shroud. And there it was, a shape, a triangle, 3 points of death, each one perfectly spaced. Carlson, Way, Vuba. At the center of the triangle, the old mining tunnel, abandoned since 1859, collapsed, sealed, forgotten, but not accidentally, because Chen Wei had written a single word beside it, origin. That's when Jeremiah understood. The murders weren't random. The gold wasn't the goal. The tunnel was. A site of something older, deeper, and far more dangerous than any vein of quartz. His wasn't just about money. It was about whatever was buried beneath the rock, and the men who would kill to keep it quiet. Suddenly, the hooves outside made sense. The silence in town. The bodies without names. They weren't erasing people. They were protecting something. And if Jeremiah wanted to expose it, he'd have to go into the tunnel, into the place where the map ended, where the murders began, where the truth was buried alive. There's an old saying in mining towns, the mountain keeps what it wants. By dusk, Jeremiah Holbrook was staring at the rusted entrance of Tunnel 6, half buried in ash, swallowed by weeds, its warning sign barely legible, condemned, cave-ins, gas pockets, do not enter. But he had to, because somewhere behind that rotten timber was the beginning, not just of death, but of the entire system. He lit a lantern using sulfur from the embalming room, strapped the ledger to his chest, and stepped inside. The first 20 feet were nothing but collapsed beams and old footprints, too small for miners. Children? No, that wasn't right. The prints circled back, over and over, like something had paced. As he moved deeper, the air grew heavy, not stale, not dead. Watched. He heard breathing. Not his. And then, the wall. It wasn't natural stone. It was black, glassy, almost wet. Scratched with hundreds of marks, claw marks, fingernails. And one sentence, repeated over and over. I was never gone. Jeremiah pressed his lantern close. Beneath the surface, barely visible, were faces, pressed into the obsidian, mouths open, eyes wide, as if the wall had taken them. Then, a hand on his shoulder. Jeremiah spun, lantern raised, but there was nothing, only the sound of dirt shifting behind him. And a low hum, like something purring deep in the rock. Then, footsteps. Real ones. Boots. Jeremiah darted into a side shaft, killing the lantern just in time to see them pass. Sheriff Coleman. Whitmer. And a third man he didn't recognize, tall, thin, wearing a silver deputy's badge with no name. They didn't speak. They just walked up to the wall and bowed. Jeremiah covered his mouth. The sheriff knelt, placed his palm on the black stone, and whispered, "Payment delivered. Claim protected. All names removed." The wall responded. It pulsed, and one of the faces, inside, the newest one, melted into nothing. Gone. Like it had never existed. Jeremiah nearly screamed, not from fear, from confirmation. This was the engine. This was why they killed. Not just to hide land deeds, not just to silence voices, but to feed this thing. The tunnel wasn't abandoned, it was active. And Jeremiah Holbrook now knew the final truth. The mountain didn't keep what it wanted. It demanded. When Jeremiah Holbrook emerged from Tunnel 6, his hands were shaking. Not from fear, from clarity. For the first time in months, the puzzle made sense. The bodies, the stolen claims, the town's eerie silence. It wasn't just corruption. It wasn't just murder. It was ritual. That tunnel, that thing behind the wall, wasn't passive. It required constant feeding. And every soul taken, every accidental death, every man who vanished after striking gold, wasn't just erased from paper. They were stripped from memory. Because now Jeremiah realized something bone-deep and terrifying. He couldn't remember what his mother looked like. Not her face, not her voice, not even her name. He flipped through the town records. Her name was gone. Her existence was gone, as if she'd never lived, never bled, never held him. And that's when he snapped. They weren't killing people, they were deleting them. Erasure as currency, sacrifice as silence. And the wall, the living rock inside Tunnel 6, was the vault. It kept what it took. And it took everything. Jeremiah returned to the funeral home with a different look in his eyes, the look of a boy who'd stared into the heart of the earth and seen memory burn. Albert, the assistant mortician, took one look at him and whispered, "You went down there, didn't you?" Jeremiah nodded. Albert sighed and handed him something he hadn't seen before, a glass vial, thick, amber-colored. Inside, ashes. "Your mother," Albert said. Jeremiah trembled. "Why did they take her?" Albert's voice cracked. "Because she remembered too much." That night, Jeremiah did the unthinkable. He broke into the sheriff's office and stole the obsidian ledger, a black book bound in human skin. Hidden behind a false drawer, it hummed in his hands. Inside, hundreds of names, each with 3 notations: claim location, method of disposal, degree of erasure. The last page, blank, waiting for the next name. His name, Jeremiah Holbrook, and beneath it scrawled in red, "The boy counts too well." He dropped the book and ran. But the damage was done. Because by reading that ledger, by knowing, he had marked himself. The system would now turn on him. Not to kill, to remove, to unwrite, to make sure the boy who counted bodies would become the boy no one remembered. Jeremiah didn't sleep. He couldn't. Because as the sun rose over Holbrook Ridge, something had changed. The town was too quiet. The birds, gone. The morning fog, unnaturally still. And worst of all, no children's voices. He walked the alleys, the schoolyard, the general store, empty. No chalk dust, no laughter, just echoes and eyes, watching him from behind curtains. And then he noticed it, on the church door. A fresh notice, nailed crooked. Town meeting tonight. Attendance required. Signed, in red wax, Sheriff Elijah Coleman, and beneath that, the elders. Jeremiah's breath caught. The elders weren't elected. They weren't named. Most people didn't even think they were real. But that notice was proof. They were stepping into the open. That night, the meeting was held in the abandoned schoolhouse, a building gutted by fire 2 years prior. No one had touched it since. Until now. When Jeremiah arrived, the pews were filled. Men with vacant expressions, women clutching rosaries with bleeding palms, and at the front, 3 chairs, empty, waiting. Then they came. Not walking, but gliding. 3 figures in dust-colored robes. No faces visible, no eyes, just mouths, always smiling. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. One of them simply said, "There is a boy who has wandered too far into the archive." Another added, "He is counting things not meant to be counted." And the third, with a voice like dry leaves, "Numbers awaken the sleeping ones." The crowd didn't react. No one blinked. No one spoke. Jeremiah stood. "What is it? What's behind Tunnel 6? Laughter. But not from the crowd, from the walls. Then, candles blew out, one by one. The middle elder stepped forward and said, "It was never a tunnel, child. It was a wound, and your mind keeps peeling the scab." The crowd turned to Jeremiah, every eye hollow, every frame empty of recognition. Even Albert, who had helped him bury the dead, looked right through him. Jeremiah backed away. "You erased them, all of them. The children, the minors, He choked. He could no longer say mother. The word vanished on his tongue. The third elder raised a black finger and whispered, "You are already forgetting. Soon they will forget you too." The crowd repeated in one voice, "Soon we will forget you too." Jeremiah ran, but as he reached the door, he saw it, his name, scratched out from the town's ledger. Just like the rest, he wasn't being hunted anymore. He was being deleted. You can't understand a curse until you trace it to the first cut. After escaping the schoolhouse, Jeremiah hid in the only place the townsfolk feared more than the truth. The Holbrook mines. Not Tunnel 6. Deeper, Tunnel 0. A sealed shaft older than the town itself, carved into the earth before maps were drawn, before English was spoken here, before men even knew this soil existed. It wasn't on any blueprint. No miner dared approach it. But Jeremiah had found a hand-drawn sketch in the obsidian ledger, wedged behind the last page, a red ink path spiraling downward. Beside it, a single word in Latin, obliviosus, the place of forgetting. He followed the map, down past collapsed shafts and rusted rail tracks, down past bones too ancient to name, until he reached it, a perfectly round hole in the bedrock. The air was colder, thicker, as if time itself couldn't move through it. Jeremiah lit a match. The walls of Tunnel 0 weren't stone. They were organic, veins, pulses, a surface that shimmered like damp skin. This wasn't a tunnel, this was a mouth. And someone, or something, had fed it for generations. Carved into the living wall was a mural, etched in blood and soot. He saw a boy, centuries ago, blindfolded, kneeling. Around him, robed figures, holding ledgers, scales, shovels, and behind them all, a tower of teeth, not human, not animal. Each tooth had a name carved into it. And in the center, a massive cavity, empty, waiting for a name. A match went out. Jeremiah struck another. The next panel of the mural showed the town being built, Holbrook Ridge, laid like a shrine around the mouth. And in the margins of the mural, scratched in a different hand, memory is the true offering. Flesh feeds the mouth, but names feed the absence. He stumbled backward, sick with dread, because now it was clear Holbrook Ridge was never meant to grow. It was never meant to thrive. It was meant to protect something, a vault, a tomb, a mouth that forgets. And for centuries the town fed it names, bodies, blood, but most of all, witnesses. That's why Jeremiah was marked. He had seen, he had remembered, and he had begun to count. And counting was the one thing the absence couldn't allow. Because the more you count, the more you see what's missing. And in Holbrook Ridge, what was missing was everything. The man was already dead when Jeremiah found him. But he still spoke. They called him Thaddeus Crane. In town he was a myth, the one who tried to burn down the Hall of Records in 1837. An act of madness, they said. They never mentioned why. But Jeremiah found him deep inside Tunnel 0, his body folded between blackened beams and ancient iron rail ties, his eyes still open. And in his chest, gripped by a skeletal hand, a notebook, wrapped in scorched leather, still warm. Jeremiah opened it. The first page. If you are reading this, you are already half erased. I failed, but maybe you won't. The notebook was a confession, a record of Thaddeus's life. He had been the last miner assigned to Tunnel 0. Back when it was still called Prospect Hollow, he and his crew unearthed a sealed chamber, a perfect dome of smooth obsidian, etched with symbols no one could read. Inside, no gold, no coal, just rows of human teeth embedded in the walls, each one tagged with a name, some ancient, some from their own time, some yet to be born. Thaddeus wrote, "We pulled 3 teeth from the wall, only 3. The first man who held one vanished that night. No sound, no scream, no trace, not even his name in the payroll. The second man went blind, but not in the eyes. He forgot faces, words. He could speak, but not communicate, as if language itself had betrayed him. The third. He whispered numbers into the dark for 5 days, then bit off his own fingers, and after that they came. The ones in robes, smiling, without names, without eyes, only memory. Thaddeus wrote, "They said the town was a vessel, the mine was a mouth, and the teeth were seals. And if any seal is broken, the old memory returns. The memory of what we did to earn the silence." That was the final line. The rest of the pages had been ripped out, but Jeremiah turned the cover and found one last message carved into the leather itself. "The ledger lies, the town lies, but fire tells the truth." And underneath, a set of coordinates, a location. One Jeremiah recognized, the cemetery behind the chapel, a place where the headstones had no names, only numbers, and one was still fresh, just 2 digits, 12. The number Jeremiah had counted just before his mother vanished. This wasn't a grave, it was a receipt. Jeremiah returned to the cemetery under cover of night. The chapel loomed behind him like a mausoleum built for liars. Its stained glass windows glowed faintly, though no candles burned inside. He ignored them. The stone marked 12 was no taller than a boot. Unmarked, untended, freshly laid dirt, but no flowers, no name, no memory, just a number. He brought the rusted spade he'd found behind Tunnel 0. It was warped and stained dark, too dark to be old rust. With each scoop the air grew colder. The soil changed, first damp, then slick, and then solid, not wood, not stone, something else. He cleared more dirt and uncovered the lid of a box, metal, ancient, but humming faintly, as if it had a heartbeat. Jeremiah paused. A noise behind him. The wind? No. A shuffling. He turned. No one. But the chapel's doors were now open. He faced the box again and pried it open. Inside was no body, just a bundle of hair, tightly knotted and soaked in resin, a child's braid. And beneath it, a page. Fragile, yellowed, but preserved. He lifted it carefully. It was a ledger page torn from the obsidian book. At the top, a symbol, a circle of teeth. In the center, a name written in crimson ink. Isaac Holbrook, a boy, age 7, date of interment, August 12, 1781. And underneath, witnessed the mouth, spoke the count, refused the offering, must be remembered, then unremembered. It was a ritual record, not a burial log, an erasure document. They hadn't buried Isaac to honor him. They buried his memory. Because he had done the one thing forbidden in Holbrook Ridge. He had counted and refused to give a name. Jeremiah's hands shook. Because scrawled at the bottom, barely legible, the line must break. One will remember, one will count, one will feed it back its name. Then, behind him, a whisper, not in his ears, in his teeth. A voice vibrating through, enamel and jaw. "You have seen too much, Jeremiah. Return the ledger, or you'll be next to feed the silence." The chapel doors slammed shut, and the number 13 etched itself onto the stone beside the grave. Fresh, red, wet. They had already chosen the next name, and it was his. When Jeremiah returned home, he no longer saw his room. He saw records, not the kind written in ink, not the kind you store in books, but the kind that live in walls, in echoes, in dust. He sat at his desk, staring at the obsidian book he'd retrieved from the grave. It pulsed like it had veins. Its pages resisted light, sucking in flame, refusing to reflect. And then, without his touch, it opened. Page 1. A list of names. But not just names. Each had a number. Each number matched a grave. And beside them, etched into the black stone, not dates of birth, but moments of silence. Seconds, hours, days. Moments when the town went quiet. June 3rd, 1805. Silence. 12 minutes. Witness. Thomas Bell. Result. Memory realignment. April 9th, 1849. Silence. 3 hours. Witness. Mary Griggs. Result. Erased. Each entry was not about death. It was about absence. Jeremiah flipped further. Page 33. His mother's name. Annabeth Holbrook. Next to her name, a red seal, unbroken. No result listed. Then he found his own. Jeremiah Holbrook. Page 34. But the seal next to his name was cracked. And next to it, written not in ink, but something darker. The counter awakens. He touched the page. The book responded. It whispered, not aloud, but directly into his thoughts. Its voice was his, but older, more tired, more resolute. To count is to remember is to resist, but resistance has a cost. He turned to the final page. Blank, except for a number scratched violently into the surface, 0, and beneath it. 0 is not the start. It is the hunger, the mouth beneath the town. It wakes, and it remembers who forgot. Suddenly, Jeremiah understood. The ledger wasn't a book of records. It was a feeding log. Each name, each silence, each memory stripped and buried, a meal for something older than the town, something that feeds not on flesh but on what you forget. And now that he had read the names, now that he had broken the seal, it was his turn. Not to forget, but to be forgotten. He looked out the window. 3 men in black coats stood silently in the road, eyes covered, mouths sewn shut, waiting, not for him, but for the ledger, because if Jeremiah didn't return it, the silence would come for all of Holbrook Ridge. The chapel hadn't changed since 1791, at least not on the surface. But Jeremiah wasn't looking for the surface. He was looking for the basement, the one the church records insisted didn't exist. The one his mother told him never to mention. He entered the chapel alone. The pews were draped in white sheets. The altar had no cross, only a black disc carved deep into the stone. A circle with teeth. At the pulpit, the floorboards were uneven. One plank, different wood, newer. He pried it up. Underneath, a trapdoor. No lock. Only a symbol scorched into the wood. 0. He hesitated, then opened it. The air was not stale. It was warm, damp, breathing. He descended. Stone steps spiraled down into something older than the church, older than Holbrook itself. The walls wept black resin. The silence was alive. As he reached the bottom, a chamber unfolded before him. Circular, smooth, like the inside of a throat. At the center, a stone table. Not an altar, a scale. On one side, teeth, human, child-sized, piled carefully. On the other, pages, ripped from memory books, journals, letters, names. Each balanced the other. One tooth, one name, one offering, one erasure. This was the engine of Holbrook Ridge. A ritual balance, a town that survived not through prayer, but through sacrifice. Jeremiah stepped closer. On the table, a space had been cleared, empty, waiting. The ledger in his hand grew warm. Pages fluttered violently. The final page, still marked 0, tore itself free and landed square in the middle of the scale. The ground shuddered. From the far wall, something peeled open. Not a door, not a gate, a mouth, massive, flesh-like, rooted into the rock. It whispered, not in language, but in subtraction. Jeremiah's thoughts flickered. Names, faces, places, vanishing one by one. The mouth was feeding. On him. He fell to his knees, but then, from his pawn, a sound. The teeth he had taken from grave 12. Child's teeth. He held them up. They glowed faintly, resisting the pull. Because these were not offerings, they were refusals. Isaac Holbrook had resisted, and now so would he. Jeremiah stood. He placed the teeth not on the scale, but into the mouth. The chamber screamed, not aloud, but through every cell of his body. The mouth recoiled, the walls cracked, and for the first time in centuries, it spat something back, a memory of the day Holbrook Ridge was founded, and the man who made the first offering, Ezekiel Holbrook, Jeremiah's ancestor, and the architect of the forgetting. The name Ezekiel Holbrook wasn't just carved into the town's founding records, it was etched into the soil. Every building, every name, every silence that followed was rooted in his first act of forgetting. And now, as Jeremiah stood in the shaking chamber beneath the chapel, he wasn't just holding a memory. He was holding the truth Holbrook Ridge was built to hide. The vision struck him like a thunderclap. No words, just immersion. He was inside Ezekiel. The town was only 12 families, starving through winter. The soil rejected crops, children wasted, and beneath the land, something called. It didn't speak in prophecy. It whispered through voids. When a child named Abel Wexley vanished without a sound, and no one remembered he ever lived, Ezekiel understood. The mouth had tasted them, not out of cruelty, but necessity, and it had a bargain to offer. Feed me memory, feed me silence, and I will shield you from decay. Ezekiel built the first chapel atop the mouth. He formed a secret covenant, a ritual, a scale, a ledger. Each time the town faced disaster, a name was chosen, a life was erased, not just killed, unremembered, and in return the land became fertile. Disease passed them over. Gold veins were discovered. Holbrook thrived, but only because of what it buried. The vision deepened. Jeremiah now stood in a snow-covered forest, watching his ancestor dig a pit. Not for a body, for a book. The original ledger. He could see the name carved into its blackened spine, the index of absence, sealed in a box of teeth. But something else was buried there too, something Ezekiel never told anyone. A face screaming silently from behind stitched lips, a child, too young to name, swaddled in burlap, and forgotten before it ever breathed. Jeremiah broke from the vision with a gasp. The chamber had collapsed. The mouth had vanished. But the memory had not. He now knew. Ezekiel had made the first offering not with a volunteer, but with his own son. The bloodline was never sacred. It was cursed. And Jeremiah, he wasn't just a descendant. He was the counterweight, the one the mouth had been waiting to rebalance the debt. But now he had the knowledge, and knowledge, once remembered, could break the cycle. Or condemn them all. Jeremiah left the ruined chapel at dawn. His skin burned, not from the sun, but from remembrance. The mouth had closed, but the memory remained. Every erased child, every silenced death, every unmarked page in Holbrook Ridge's past, he now carried them all. And they were hungry. His mother was waiting for him on the ridge, not weeping, not relieved, just silent. She handed him a wrapped object, an old revolver, rusty, loaded. "If you're going to rewrite the rules," she said, "something still needs to bleed." Jeremiah didn't speak. He looked down at the ledger in his arms. It was no longer empty. Page after page had returned. Scrawled in handwriting, not his own. The lost names, the offerings, the counterweights. He turned to the final page. His name was already written, not by his hand, but by Isaac Holbrook, the boy whose teeth he had stolen from grave 12, the boy who had tried to warn them, the boy who had resisted the mouth and paid for it. Jeremiah understood now. This wasn't just a history of death. It was a ledger of inheritance. Every generation, one child was chosen, not to die, but to remember, to hold the weight of every unspoken crime, to stand before the town and decide, who will we bury, and who will we forget? He walked to the town square. Sunday bells echoed through the fog. The townsfolk gathered, quiet, reverent, afraid. They knew. The silence had been broken. Jeremiah climbed the steps of the old courthouse. He held up the ledger. "I have the names," he said. "I have the ledger. I have the truth." A murmur, then silence. This town was built on subtraction, on sacrifice, on forgetting what should have never been forgiven. No more. He tore the final page from the ledger, the page with his own name, and burned it in front of them. The wind shifted. The ground trembled, but did not open. The mouth had been denied, but the cost was still due. Someone would have to bear the burden. His mother stepped forward. "Then let me carry it." She took the ledger from his hands and walked back toward the chapel. Jeremiah wanted to stop her, but he didn't, because that's what memory demands. Mercy, and sometimes mercy means letting someone else forget. The next morning, the birds didn't sing, and yet everyone heard something. Laughter, soft, childlike, echoing from the ravine where the chapel once stood. It wasn't the kind of laughter that warmed the heart. It was the kind that gnawed at it. Jeremiah awoke with a torn voice and blood in his mouth. His dreams were no longer his own. They belonged to others. Dead boys, forgotten girls, a town full of vanished children now whispering inside his head. He rushed into the street and saw something no one had seen in over a century, a mass grave rising from the soil, bones clawing upward, names etched into fragments of wood, dozens, hundreds. The townspeople gathered, dazed, horrified. They couldn't look away, because now they recognized the names. On one plank, Caleb Mercer, age 9, the child who moved away in 1894. Another, Margaret Lee, age 12, the girl who ran off with her uncle in 1912. One by one, the lies unraveled, and the ledger no longer held them back. Because the ledger was gone, burned, buried, or worse, consumed. And with its death, so came the flood of memory. Jeremiah watched as townspeople screamed into the soil, parents collapsing onto skeletons they once claimed never existed, grandmothers who suddenly remembered babies they never birthed. Holbrook Ridge was unraveling. Its silence had kept them alive, but memory was waking them up, and the price of remembering was madness. One man gouged out his eyes. Another lit his home on fire, trying to erase the echoes. Even the sheriff wandered into the woods, whispering apologies to the trees, as if the pines themselves were witnesses. Jeremiah sat in the ruins of the courthouse, clutching a name he could not place. Jeriah, scratched into his own palm. Not Jeremiah. Jeriah, a name forgotten or stolen. He stared into the distance, where his mother had vanished. No woe, no sound, just the echo of turning pages in the wind. Holbrook Ridge could no longer lie. The soil had spoken, the bones had risen, and for the first time in 134 years, the town remembered, but it was too late to forget again. The boy who counted bodies was never supposed to be Jeremiah Holbrook, because there was never a Jeremiah Holbrook. Not really. The name first appeared in the 1861 census, scribbled in beside Isaac Holbrook's, then crossed out. Isaac's twin, but no town records ever listed his birth. No grave marked his death, and yet his voice lived on, in the whispers behind closed doors, in the scribbled numbers carved into the floorboards of the old schoolhouse, in the dreams of children who'd never met him, but drew his face in charcoal and ash. Jeremiah was a construction, a vessel made of memory, grief, and denial, a ledger given form. He didn't count the bodies. He was the count, the final sum, a flesh-bound consequence of generations of silence. The night before the town crumbled, he walked back into the ruins of the chapel. But there were no ruins, just a pristine white room, circular, pulsing, alive. He stepped into the center, and the mouth spoke, not in words, but in revelations. You were never sent to remember. You were sent to awaken us. And now, we are hungry. Jeremiah tried to scream, but his mouth opened and only numbers came out. 134 children. 7 generations, 13 offerings per decade, 3 ledger keepers, 1 truth. The mouth grinned. The chapel became a throat. The wind outside stopped. The bones fell silent, and the town of Holbrook Ridge collapsed inward, not into ruin, but into recollection, back into the collective memory of guilt, into the mouth. A monument was discovered years later during construction, a stone tablet buried beneath layers of untouched soil. On it, a single phrase, "He counted us all," then he counted himself, and below it, J.H., whoever carved it didn't sign their name, because they didn't have one left. Epilogue: if you drive through Tennessee today, there's no Sigurd of Holbrook Ridge. No roads lead to it, no maps mark it, no families trace lineage back to it. But some say if you walk far enough into the woods, past where even the birds go silent, you'll find an old chapel with no door. Inside it, a boy sits alone, scribbling names into a book that's already full. He'll look up. He'll ask for your name. And if you answer, you won't leave with it.